The screaming started before the band could even finish "Here Comes the Bride." Because 42 head of cattle came thundering through a hole in the fence I hadn't bothered to fix, scattering across white linen tables, crystal stemware shattering under hooves while the bride's veil tangled around the horns of my grumpiest heifer, Dolly. And for the first time in 8 months, I felt nothing but pure, glorious relief. My name is Claire Donovan, and 3 hours earlier I had been standing at my kitchen window watching 300 wedding guests park their luxury SUVs across my late grandfather's hayfield, because Linda Whitmore, president of the Briarcliff Estates HOA next door, had decided my family farm would make the perfect backdrop for her daughter Madison's $1 million wedding. What none of those guests knew, sipping champagne under string lights I never agreed to hang, was that I hadn't actually given Linda permission for any of this. Not really, not honestly, and that the gate latch on the north pasture, the one holding back my entire herd, had been left open on purpose by me exactly 4 minutes before the ceremony began. I grew up on this land 60 miles outside Nashville, the third generation to wake before sunrise feeding cattle my grandfather Walt bought with money he saved working the railroad. After he passed, the farm became mine and my husband Mark's, 210 acres of red dirt, soybean fields, and a herd of black Angus that paid our mortgage and put our daughter through community college. We weren't rich, but we were proud, and the farm had survived droughts, recessions, and a tornado that took half our barn in 2019. When Briarcliff Estates, a gated subdivision of $500,000 homes, went up next door 3 years ago, I never imagined the woman elected to run its homeowners association would become the biggest threat my family's land had ever faced. Linda Whitmore moved into Briarcliff with her husband Gerald the year the development opened, and within 6 months she talked her way onto the HOA board, then maneuvered the sitting president into early retirement. By her second year, she ran that community like a tiny kingdom, citing neighbors for grass half an inch too tall and mailboxes painted the wrong shade of cream. Our properties shared a fence line, and Linda decided early on that my farm, with its mud, manure smell, and occasional escaped chicken, was an eyesore dragging down her precious property values. She started sending letters, actual certified letters, demanding I plant a privacy hedge at my own expense so her clubhouse view wouldn't include my cattle grazing. I ignored the first letter, assuming it was a joke. The second arrived with a veiled threat about looking into county nuisance ordinances. By the third, Linda had somehow gotten a county code enforcement officer named Pete Salinger to drive out and inspect my barn, my fencing, even my grandfather's old tool shed, looking for any violation she could use against me. What I didn't know then was that Pete Salinger was Linda's husband Gerald's younger brother, a fact that would matter a great deal later, because every single inspection somehow turned up something, no matter how clean I kept the place. A loose board became a structural hazard. A compost pile became unsanitary waste. Mark wanted to fight every citation in court, but lawyers cost money we didn't have, so mostly I just paid the fines and fixed whatever Linda's complaints invented, swallowing my pride one certified letter at a time, telling myself it was easier than a legal battle with a woman who clearly had more time and money than I did. Then came the easement dispute. A gravel access road cut through the corner of my property, one my grandfather had used for 60 years to move equipment between fields, and Linda decided Briarcliff residents had a right to use it as a shortcut to the highway, cutting my commute in half and my privacy down to nothing. I had the original deed, signed in 1962, proving the road belonged solely to the Donovan family with no public right-of-way whatsoever, but Linda hired a lawyer anyway, claiming historical use by Briarcliff residents justified an easement, even though Briarcliff hadn't existed until 3 years earlier. The county sided with me eventually, but only after 4 months of stress, $2,000 in legal fees, and a steady stream of Briarcliff residents driving across my field anyway, waving cheerfully at me like I was the unreasonable one for minding tire ruts through my soybean rows. Madison, Linda's daughter, was different from her mother. Quiet, a little nervous, always apologizing with her eyes whenever Linda made a scene. I'd see her sometimes at the farmer's market, buying our eggs, and she'd linger to ask about the cows, genuinely curious in a way that made me almost like her, despite everything. Madison got engaged that spring to a sweet, awkward guy named Tyler who worked in HVAC and clearly adored her, and Linda transformed overnight from controlling neighborhood tyrant into a woman possessed by wedding planning, the kind who treated her daughter's marriage as a personal branding opportunity. She wanted a rustic chic farm wedding, the exact aesthetic plastered across every wedding magazine that year, string lights and mason jars and a barn. Backdrop for the photographer, except Briarcliff had no actual farm, just manicured lawns and a community pool. So Linda's eyes landed, inevitably, on mine. She showed up unannounced one Tuesday morning, smiling wider than I'd ever seen, complimenting my barn's character, as if she hadn't sent code enforcement after that very barn 8 months earlier. I should have known right then that whatever she wanted would cost me more than she was offering. Linda offered $3,000 to rent my back pasture and barn for one Saturday in October, claiming it would be such a fun way to finally be neighbors. And even though every instinct told me to say no, Mark and I were behind on a tractor payment, and $3,000 was $3,000. I told her I'd think about it and talk to Mark, which should have been the end of the conversation, but Linda apparently heard yes instead, because by Friday she'd already posted on the Briarcliff community Facebook page about her daughter's gorgeous upcoming farm wedding, tagging my farm's name like it was already settled. That was the first real warning sign. Not the offer itself, but how quickly Linda turned a maybe into a done deal. How naturally she assumed my land was hers to claim the moment it served her purposes, exactly the way she treated that gravel road, exactly the way she treated everything in Briarcliff she decided she wanted. I called Linda that evening to set the record straight, and she laughed it off, saying the Facebook post was just excitement, promising nothing was final until we signed paperwork. Mark sat beside me shaking his head, already certain this would end badly, but the tractor payment was due in 3 weeks, and $3,000 still sounded like salvation. We agreed to meet at my kitchen table to draw up a real contract, just the two of us, no lawyers needed for something this small. Linda arrived with a folder of vision boards instead of paperwork, talking string light vendors and floral arches, treating the legal details as an afterthought she'd get to eventually. I insisted on specifics before anything else. One Saturday only, the back pasture and barn exclusively, cattle moved entirely to the north fields beforehand, no access to the house, the equipment shed, or my crops. Linda agreed to every line so readily I almost felt guilty for doubting her. We signed a simple 2-page contract that afternoon, $3,000 refundable deposit terms, clearly defined boundaries in black and white. I photographed both pages with my phone before Linda left, a habit my grandfather always preached, and that single decision would matter more than I could have guessed. Within a week, Linda's wedding planner, a brisk woman named Sherry with a clipboard and a habit of measuring things with her eyes, showed up to walk the property, except she walked far past the back pasture, scouting locations near my house for what she called getting ready photos. I redirected Sherry firmly back to the agreed boundary, and she apologized, blaming Linda for giving her outdated notes. It was a small thing, easy to write off as confusion, but it was the first crack in a pattern I hadn't yet learned to recognize for what it was. 2 delivery trucks arrived unannounced the following Tuesday, hauling lumber for a dance floor, and the drivers cut straight across my newly planted winter wheat to reach the barn, leaving ruts I'd be staring at every morning until spring. Linda apologized over text but never offered to cover the replanting cost. I brought up the wheat damage at our next call, and Linda's tone shifted instantly, from honeyed to clipped, reminding me she'd already invested thousands in vendors and couldn't be bothered with minor field issues. It was the first time I heard the version of Linda her neighbors complained about. Madison called me directly that week, voice small and apologetic, saying her mother had gotten a little intense about the wedding and asking if I could just bear with it a little longer. I told her, of course, mostly because I liked her, and partly because backing out now meant losing the deposit already spent on seed. Mark wasn't convinced by my reassurances. He'd grown up around men like Gerald Whitmore at the feed store, men who let their wives run roughshod over neighbors because confrontation felt beneath them, and he warned me Linda wouldn't stop pushing until somebody made her. The first real fight happened over the cocktail hour location. Linda wanted guests mingling near the old oak tree by the creek, a spot well outside our agreed boundary, claiming it was too perfect not to use, and when I said no, she accused me of nickel-and-diming her daughter's happiness. I held firm, repeating the contract terms word for word, and Linda eventually relented, but not before muttering something about how people who need the money shouldn't be so difficult. A comment that stung worse than any fine Pete Salinger had ever written me. That same week, a new citation arrived from the county. My hay bales, stacked exactly where they'd been stacked for 30 years, were suddenly a visual blight violation, filed, predictably, right after my refusal about the oak tree, with Pete Salinger's signature at the bottom. I started keeping a folder of every interaction with Linda, every citation, every text message, every photo of property damage, not because I had a plan yet, just because something in my gut told me I'd need proof eventually that I wasn't the unreasonable one in this arrangement. Linda's florist arrived next, draping fabric over my barn rafters without asking, drilling small holes into beams my grandfather had hand-cut decades earlier. When I objected, Linda waved it off as nothing a little wood filler can't fix, as though my family's history were hers to drill through. Sherry the planner quietly pulled me aside one afternoon and apologized, admitting Linda kept changing the guest count upward without telling anyone, now pushing past 250 people for a venue we'd agreed would hold no more than 150 comfortably. I confronted Linda about the guest count, and she insisted a few more people wouldn't matter, that my barn was plenty big, conveniently forgetting our contract specified exact numbers precisely because more guests meant more parking, more strain, more chances for something to go wrong. Gerald Whitmore came by once, almost sheepishly, to apologize for Linda being Linda, admitting in a low voice that she'd been stressed about the country club thing, a comment he immediately backpedaled from when I asked what country club thing he meant. I let the comment go at the time, distracted by more pressing fights, but I wrote it down in my folder anyway, underlined, a stray thread I had a feeling I'd need to pull eventually, once I understood why Linda needed this wedding to be so much bigger than what we'd agreed to. The HOA newsletter that month featured a glowing 2-page spread about Madison's upcoming dream farm wedding, complete with mock-up photos of my barn digitally decorated beyond recognition. My family's land repackaged as Linda's personal triumph for every Briarcliff resident to admire. Neighbors I'd never met started waving at me from their cars, telling me how exciting it must be to host such a beautiful event. And I realized Linda had turned my farm into her own publicity campaign without ever once asking whether I wanted that kind of attention. I brought the newsletter to Linda, asking her to clarify with everyone that this was a private rental, not some open invitation, and she brushed me off, saying people just love a good story, refusing to see the difference between her story and my actual, lived reality. Madison apologized again, this time in person at my kitchen table, tears in her eyes, admitting she never wanted anything this big, that she'd asked for a small backyard ceremony months ago and her mother had simply overridden her, the way Linda overrode everyone eventually. I told Madison the truth, that I worried her wedding was becoming less about her and more about her mother proving something to people who likely didn't even care, and Madison just nodded, like she'd already known that for a long time and had stopped expecting anyone to fix it. Tension at home grew too. Mark started keeping his own notes about vendor trucks, fence damage, and missed promises, building a paper trail alongside mine. Both of us sensing this wedding had stopped being a simple rental and had become something we needed to survive rather than profit from. Linda called one evening demanding access to my equipment shed for extra chair storage. And when I refused, citing the contract, she threatened to reconsider the whole arrangement. A threat that would have been almost funny if it hadn't been clear she meant it as leverage, not negotiation. I called her bluff, calmly reminding her the non-refundable deposit clause cut both ways. And she went quiet for a long moment before hanging up without another word. The first real silence in weeks of constant demands, and somehow that silence worried me more than her shouting ever had. 2 days later, an addendum arrived by email, supposedly reflecting agreed changes to our contract, expanding the venue boundary to include the equipment shed, the creekside oak, and an extra 50 guests, with a signature line at the bottom that looked uncomfortably close to my own. I never signed that addendum, and I told Linda so immediately, furious, demanding she explain where that signature came from, and she claimed it was a simple miscommunication with Sherry, blaming her planner instead of answering the real question I'd actually asked her. That night, Mark and I sat at the table comparing my actual signature to the one on Linda's addendum under a desk lamp, and even though it wasn't a perfect match, it was close enough to terrify me, close enough that I finally understood exactly what kind of fight I was really in. I drove the addendum straight to a notary friend the next morning, a woman named Patty who'd known my grandfather, and she confirmed what I already suspected. The signature had clearly been traced from my original contract page, photocopied and pasted onto new terms I'd never agreed to. Armed with Patty's notarized statement, I called Linda and laid it out plainly. Forge one more document, and I'd cancel the wedding entirely, deposit or no deposit, lawsuit or no lawsuit. For once, Linda didn't argue back immediately, which somehow felt more unsettling than her usual bluster. She showed up the next day with pie, actual homemade peach pie, apologizing in a tone so warm it almost convinced me, blaming wedding stress and promising the boundaries would stay exactly as originally signed. No shed, no oak tree, no extra guests beyond our agreed number. I wanted to believe her, mostly because canceling now meant losing money we genuinely needed, and partly because some stubborn part of me still hoped the woman bringing pie to my kitchen table was more real than the one threatening lawsuits over the phone 2 nights earlier. Mark wasn't fooled for a second. He pointed out fairly that apologizing only happened right after we caught her forging something, not before, and that pattern, push until caught, apologize, push again, was exactly how Linda had operated with every neighbor since she'd taken over that HOA board. Still, I agreed to continue, partly for Madison's sake, partly because I had no real legal path to recoup money already spent on replanted wheat and damaged barn beams if I walked away now. I told myself I'd simply watch Linda more closely than I had before. The forged addendum disappeared from conversation entirely, never mentioned again by either of us, which felt less like resolution and more like Linda simply filing the idea away for later use, the way she'd filed away every other small grievance she eventually weaponized against someone. Pete Salinger showed up again that week, this time inspecting my driveway culvert, citing it as a drainage hazard that needed immediate repair. Conveniently timed 2 days after I'd threatened to cancel the wedding entirely over the forged signature. I started recognizing the rhythm by now. Every time I pushed back against Linda, a new citation appeared within 48 hours, always signed by Pete, always vague enough to be technically defensible, always specific enough to cost me money I didn't have to spare. I mentioned the pattern to Patty the notary, who mentioned, almost in passing, that Pete Salinger was Gerald Whitmore's younger brother. Information that hit me like a physical weight, connecting dots I'd somehow never bothered connecting in 8 months of dealing with both men. Suddenly every citation made sense, not as random county enforcement, but as a direct extension of Linda's will, funneled through family connections, dressed up in official letterhead to look neutral when it had never been neutral at all. Not once, not from the very first letter. I requested Pete's full inspection history on my property through a public records request, a slow process that would take weeks, but one I filed anyway, adding it to the folder that had grown from a few photos into something resembling an actual case file against the Whitmore family. Meanwhile, wedding preparations accelerated. A massive event tent arrived, far larger than anything I'd pictured for 150 guests, and when I questioned the size, Sherry admitted, almost apologetically, that Linda had quietly bumped the count back up to 220. I confronted Linda directly this time, no pie required, demanding she honor the original guest count or pay an additional fee for the difference, citing the contract clause we'd both signed in good faith back when this had still felt like a reasonable arrangement between neighbors. Linda agreed to the additional fee with surprising speed, writing a check on the spot which should have reassured me, except something about how easily she handed over that money made me wonder, for the first time, exactly where Linda's seemingly endless wedding budget was actually coming from. Gerald worked in mid-level insurance sales, steady but unremarkable, and Linda hadn't worked outside the home in years. Yet between the venue rental, florist, photographer, custom dance floor, and now an oversized tent, the wedding budget had clearly crossed six figures with no obvious source. I mentioned this quietly to Mark, who shrugged it off as none of our business, but the thought lodged itself in my mind anyway, sitting beside that earlier comment Gerald had made about Linda being stressed about the country club thing. Two loose threads I still hadn't connected. My daughter Riley, home from community college for the weekend, overheard me venting to Mark and mentioned, almost casually, that a friend's mom served on the Briarcliff HOA Finance Committee and had recently quit, complaining online about shady budget stuff nobody wanted to investigate. I asked Riley to get me that woman's name and number, and within a day I was sitting across from Carol Jennings, the former HOA treasurer, a sharp, no-nonsense retiree who'd resigned 3 months earlier rather than keep signing off on numbers she no longer trusted. Carol explained, carefully, that the HOA's Community Reserve Fund, money meant for road repairs, pool maintenance, and emergency repairs, had shrunk dramatically over the past year, while Linda kept approving beautification consulting fees paid to vendors Carol had never heard of before. When I mentioned the wedding's surprisingly lavish budget, Carol went quiet for a moment, then said plainly that several of those mysterious beautification consulting payments had gone to a florist and an event planner, the exact same florist and planner currently working on Madison's wedding. I sat in my truck afterward for a long time, hands on the wheel, absorbing what Carol had just handed me. Linda wasn't just bullying me out of cheap labor and free venue access. She appeared to be funding her daughter's entire wedding using money stolen from her own neighbor's reserve fund. Carol agreed to pull together whatever documentation she still had access to, old board minutes, payment authorizations, anything that might prove the connection, though she warned me it would take time, and that Linda had grown skilled at making suspicious numbers look boring on paper. I didn't confront Linda with any of this yet. Instead, I kept the folder growing quietly. Forged addendum, citation pattern, Carol's testimony, while outwardly continuing preparations for a wedding I now understood far better than the woman organizing it ever realized I did. Madison visited again the following week, this time bringing Tyler along, and over coffee she finally admitted what I'd suspected for a while. Her mother had been rejected for membership at the Pemberton Hills Country Club 2 years earlier, an insult Linda had never stopped quietly seething over. According to Madison, the club's selection committee cited fit concerns, a polite way of saying the old money families running Pemberton Hills didn't consider new money Briarcliff residents the right kind of neighbor, and Linda had spent every day since trying to prove them catastrophically wrong. My farm wedding, Madison explained through tears, wasn't really about her at all. It was Linda's attempt to host something so spectacular, so widely photographed and envied, that Pemberton Hills would finally have to acknowledge the Whitmore name as worth respecting after all. Hearing that broke something open in me, not anger exactly, more like clarity. Every forged signature, every citation, every stolen reserve dollar suddenly made sense as symptoms of the same disease. A woman so desperate for validation she'd burn down every relationship around her chasing it. I told Madison none of this was her fault, that she deserved a wedding built on what she actually wanted, not her mother's wounded pride, and Madison, for the first time since I'd met her, cried in a way that felt like relief rather than apology. That night I told Mark everything, the country club rejection, the embezzlement suspicions, Carol's documentation efforts, and he sat quietly for a long while before saying what I already half believed myself. This wedding was no longer a business arrangement we could simply walk away from cleanly. Canceling now risked an immediate lawsuit over the non-refundable deposit, plus whatever new citations Pete might invent in retaliation, while continuing meant lending our farm, our family's legacy, to a celebration funded partly by stolen neighbor money and partly by my own quiet humiliation. We needed a third option, something that protected our farm legally while still letting consequences eventually land on Linda rather than on us, and slowly, over several sleepless nights, the outline of one began to take shape, simple, almost embarrassingly low-tech for a problem this complicated. My cattle had always grazed the north pasture during big events, kept safely behind a sturdy wire fence. Linda's contractors had specifically reinforced themselves so guests wouldn't worry about wandering livestock interrupting their photographs of my family's repurposed land. If that fence, through no deliberate sabotage I could ever be blamed for, simply happened to fail at exactly the wrong moment, no court in the county could call that anything but an unfortunate accident, the kind that happens on working farms more often than city folks ever realize. I said nothing of this plan aloud, not even to Mark, not yet, focusing instead on quietly making sure Carol's documentation, Patty's notarized statement, and my own folder of citations stayed safely backed up somewhere Linda could never access or destroy. Wedding preparations rolled forward regardless, oblivious to the storm gathering underneath them. Linda hired a videographer specifically to capture candid farm moments, unaware she was essentially commissioning the very evidence that would later broadcast her unraveling to the entire internet. Sherry the planner, increasingly exhausted by Linda's constant scope changes, confided in me one afternoon that she'd never worked with a client this demanding. This convinced every detail needed to outshine some unnamed rival nobody else involved in the wedding had ever even met. I asked, carefully, whether that rival might be Pemberton Hills Country Club, and Sherry blinked in surprise before admitting Linda had indeed mentioned the club twice, once comparing flower arrangements to what those snobs probably have. A detail Sherry had dismissed as odd, not significant. 2 weeks before the wedding, Carol delivered a thick manila folder to my kitchen table. Copies of HOA financial statements, board meeting minutes, and bank transfer records clearly tracing thousands of reserve fund dollars into accounts belonging to Madison's florist and event planner. I photographed every page twice, stored copies in 3 separate locations, and mailed one full set to a local newspaper reporter named Dana Brooks who'd previously written about HOA disputes in the area, asking her simply to hold the documents until I gave her the go-ahead. Dana called back within the hour, intrigued, asking what exactly I expected to happen, and I told her honestly. I didn't know yet, but something was coming, and when it arrived, I wanted someone trustworthy already paying attention, ready to tell the story accurately. Pete Salinger appeared one final time before the wedding, citing my north pasture fence itself as insufficiently maintained. A laughably specific complaint given that Linda's own contractors had reinforced that exact fence weeks earlier for the very event he claimed it endangered. I signed for the citation without argument, almost amused by the irony, knowing full well that whatever happened to that fence in the coming days would no longer be something Pete or Linda or anyone else could pin entirely on careless county-sided neglect on my part. Linda called the night before the wedding, voice tight with excitement rather than apology, running through a final checklist, oblivious to Carol's folder, oblivious to Dana Brooks waiting by her phone, oblivious to the fence she'd unknowingly handed me every excuse I'd ever need. I answered every question politely, confirmed every detail she asked about, and hung up the phone feeling strangely calm, the way I imagined storm chasers must feel watching a sky turn green and still, knowing exactly what was coming long before anyone else even sensed the pressure dropping. For a few days that week, an odd peace had settled over the farm. Linda, perhaps sensing she'd pushed enough, eased off entirely, stopped calling with new demands, stopped sending Sherry on unauthorized property walks, almost as though some invisible truce had quietly been declared. Madison visited one last time before the big day, calmer now, telling me she'd decided to simply survive the wedding her mother wanted and plan a real, intimate vow renewal with Tyler later, just the two of them on terms nobody else got to dictate or photograph for clout. I admired that decision more than I let on, recognizing in Madison the same quiet stubbornness that had kept my family's farm alive through droughts and tornadoes and certified letters, the kind of strength that doesn't shout, just endures, then eventually rebuilds on its own terms. Mark spent that lull repairing fences across the rest of the property, almost compulsively, and when I asked why, he just said he wanted everything else solid, in case the north pasture gets complicated. A sentence we both understood completely without needing to say anything further. By Friday evening, the barn stood transformed, draped in fabric and fairy lights. The dance floor gleaming under temporary string bulbs, 220 chairs arranged in perfect rows, and 42 head of cattle grazing quietly in the north pasture, utterly unaware they were about to become the most talked about wedding guests in Tennessee. Saturday morning arrived clear and golden, exactly the kind of October day Linda had no doubt been praying for. The sky a flawless blue behind my barn's newly draped fabric. The air crisp enough to make every photograph look like a magazine spread nobody could ever accuse of looking ordinary. Vendors arrived in waves starting at 6 a.m., caterers, florists, a string quartet warming up instruments near the barn door, a videographer adjusting drone equipment in my driveway, all moving with the practiced urgency of people who'd clearly worked dozens of weddings exactly this size before. I stayed mostly out of sight in the farmhouse, watching through curtains as my family's land transformed into something almost unrecognizable, beautiful in its way, though every beautiful detail felt like one more thread in a story Linda had written entirely without my input. Riley came home early to help, mostly moving our personal belongings out of view, hiding tools, locking the equipment shed Linda had once demanded access to, treating the whole morning like preparing for a storm rather than a celebration, which, in fairness, was exactly what it was. Mark checked the north pasture fence one final time around 8 a.m., running his hand along the wire the way he always did before storms, not fixing anything, just confirming what we both already knew. It would hold exactly as long as we needed it to, and not 1 minute longer. Linda arrived at 9, dressed already in mother-of-the-bride attire far too formal for a morning of setup, directing vendors with sharp, clipped instructions, occasionally glancing toward my farmhouse with an expression I could only describe as triumphant, like she'd already won something. She found me briefly near the barn, gripping my arm with manicured fingers, thanking me effusively for finally coming around to her vision, as though the past 8 months had been some minor disagreement rather than forgery, theft, and harassment dressed up as neighborly enthusiasm. I smiled and said nothing meaningful back, conserving my energy for what was coming, while Linda swept past toward the dance floor to inspect floral arrangements, utterly convinced this day belonged entirely to her, exactly the way she'd convinced herself the gravel road once did. Madison found me near the farmhouse porch around 10, already dressed, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her own veil, and she squeezed my hand tightly, whispering thanks for everything. A word that felt heavier than she probably realized given everything I hadn't yet told her. I almost warned her then, almost told her to brace herself for whatever was coming, but stopped myself, deciding the kindest thing I could do was let her have this morning, calm and hopeful, before whatever happened later happened entirely without her needing to carry the weight of knowing first. Guests began arriving around 11. Luxury SUVs lining the gravel road Linda had once tried to claim as public, parking attendants directing traffic. Across my hayfield exactly as Linda had originally planned months earlier, back when this had still felt like a simple, if unwelcome, rental agreement. 220 guests eventually filled the rows of white chairs facing the barn, Briarcliff neighbors mingling with Whitmore relatives, everyone dressed like they'd stepped out of a catalog, nobody aware they were standing on land whose owner had spent the past week quietly preparing evidence against their hostess. I watched from the porch as the string quartet began playing, recognizing pieces from weddings I'd attended decades earlier, feeling an odd, hollow nostalgia for a version of this day that might have existed if Linda had simply asked nicely instead of forging, threatening, and stealing her way here. Dana Brooks, the reporter, texted me discreetly around 11:30, confirming she was parked just outside the property line. Camera ready, waiting for whatever signal I'd promised to send once things began unfolding the way I'd quietly arranged for them to unfold. Carol Jennings sent her own message too, simply wishing me luck, attaching one final document she'd uncovered overnight. Proof that Linda had personally authorized the largest reserve fund withdrawal just 6 weeks earlier, timed precisely with the wedding's largest vendor deposits. The ceremony began at noon exactly, Madison walking down a flower-lined aisle toward Tyler, who looked genuinely overwhelmed with joy despite everything happening around him. And for one brief moment I almost forgot the storm I'd been quietly assembling beneath this entire production. Linda sat in the front row beaming, dabbing theatrical tears with a monogrammed handkerchief, occasionally glancing back at the crowd to gauge their reactions, more interested, it seemed, in being witnessed enjoying her daughter's wedding than in actually experiencing it. Gerald stood near the aisle filming on his phone, oblivious to Pete Salinger seated 3 rows back, oblivious to Carol's documents sitting in Dana Brooks's car just past the property line, oblivious to anything beyond the perfectly choreographed ceremony unfolding exactly as Linda had scripted it. Vows were exchanged beneath the barn's draped fabric entrance, Tyler's voice cracking with sincerity, Madison's tears finally seeming like her own rather than performed for an audience. A brief, genuine moment of happiness sitting uneasily alongside everything I knew was coming. The officiant pronounced them married just after 12:30. Applause rippling through the crowd, champagne corks popping near the catering tent, the string quartet shifting into something livelier, and somewhere out in the north pasture, 42 cattle continued grazing, utterly indifferent to the celebration. Cocktail hour began near the barn's side lawn, guests mingling with drinks in hand, admiring the rustic decor Linda had insisted upon. Several Briarcliff residents loudly praising the authentic farm charm of a property they'd spent the past year complaining smelled too much like livestock. I moved quietly among the edges of the crowd, accepting compliments I didn't entirely deserve credit for, watching the clock, watching Pete Salinger drink his second glass of wine, watching Linda work the room like a politician collecting votes for an office nobody else had agreed to elect her into. Madison found me again briefly, glowing now, genuinely happy despite everything, and something in her expression made me hesitate, wondering for just a moment whether I should call off what I'd planned entirely. Let this one beautiful afternoon simply exist without consequence. Mark caught my eye from across the lawn and gave a small, deliberate shake of his head, a silent reminder of the forged signature, the stolen reserve funds, the months of certified letters, and I remembered all over again exactly why this day could never be allowed to end the way Linda intended. The reception moved into the barn around 1:30. Guests finding their seats at tables draped in linen Linda had specifically chosen to photograph beautifully against weathered wood. The dance floor gleaming, the 4-tier wedding cake displayed prominently near the head table. A photographer circled constantly, capturing candid shots Linda would later post triumphantly across every social platform she used, framing the entire afternoon as evidence of her own taste, her own success, her own quiet victory over whatever judgment Pemberton Hills Country Club had once passed on her. Speeches began around 2, Gerald's rambling and sentimental, a bridesmaid's funny and warm, and then Linda's, which somehow centered more on herself, her vision, her tireless work securing this venue, than on Madison and Tyler's actual relationship, a detail several guests noticed with visible discomfort. I watched Linda's speech from near the barn door, noting how she described convincing the farm's owner to host this wedding, glossing over forged documents and certified threats with a single breezy sentence about neighborly cooperation, rewriting 8 months of harassment into a charming anecdote. Something in me hardened completely during that speech, any lingering hesitation from Madison's earlier happiness evaporating entirely, replaced by absolute clarity that Linda would never stop rewriting reality to flatter herself unless something forced the truth into a room she couldn't control. I excused myself quietly around 2:30, walking the long way toward the north pasture, checking my phone one final time, confirming Dana Brooks remained parked nearby, confirming Carol's documents sat ready, confirming everything I'd spent weeks quietly arranging was finally, fully in place. The cake cutting was scheduled for 3, the first dance for 3:30. A tight schedule Sherry had built around golden hour photography. Every minute of this wedding engineered for maximum visual impact, every detail calculated except for the one detail nobody but me had bothered calculating at all. I reached the north pasture gate at 2:50. Hand resting on the latch mark had quietly oiled the night before, checking once more that the cattle remained calm, grazing steadily, completely unaware they were about to become the most consequential guests at Madison Whitmore's wedding. My phone buzzed. Riley, texting that cake cutting had just begun. Guests gathering near the head table. Linda positioning herself directly beside Madison for photographs despite not being asked. Exactly the kind of small selfish moment that had defined this entire process from its very first letter. I thought about Carol losing her volunteer position over numbers nobody else wanted to question, about Patty confirming a forged signature traced from my own contract, about Pete's endless bogus citations, about Madison's quiet tears at my kitchen table admitting none of this had ever truly been her choice. I thought, finally, about my grandfather Walt, who'd worked this land honestly for 60 years, who'd never once let anyone bully him out of what was rightfully his, and who would have found Linda Whitmore's entire performance, frankly, beneath contempt long before any of this reached its present point. At exactly 2 minutes to 3, I lifted the latch on the north pasture gate, stepping back calmly, watching it swing open under nothing more than a gentle afternoon breeze. The kind of small, unremarkable accident that happens on working farms more often than city folks ever realize. The cattle noticed the open gate almost immediately, drawn first by curiosity, then by the unfamiliar smell of caterers' grilled meat drifting from the barn, then by the simple animal instinct that follows any sudden burst of noise, music, or movement happening somewhere just beyond their fence line. Dolly, my oldest and most stubborn heifer, moved first, ambling through the open gate with the unhurried confidence of an animal who'd never once needed permission to go anywhere on this farm. And within moments the rest of the herd followed her exactly as cattle always do. I texted Dana a single word, "Now!" then walked calmly back toward the barn, timing my arrival to coincide precisely with the first distant rumble of hooves crossing open pasture. 42 cattle moving steadily, then quickly, then unstoppably toward the source of all that delicious commotion. Inside the barn, the first dance was just beginning, Madison and Tyler swaying beneath string lights, guests recording on their phones, Linda standing near. The edge of the dance floor glowing with satisfaction, utterly unaware that her carefully curated afternoon had roughly 90 seconds left of peace remaining. The first sign of trouble was a sound. Distant at first, low and rumbling, easy to mistake for thunder until someone near the open barn doors shouted that thunder didn't usually come accompanied by dust clouds and the unmistakable bawling of 42 startled, excited cattle at full charge. Guests near the entrance scattered first, drinks dropping, chairs overturning. The string quartet abandoning their instruments mid-note as the herd burst through the loosely staked decorative fencing Linda's contractors had installed purely for photographic charm rather than actual containment. Dolly led the charge directly toward the catering tables, drawn by the scent of roasted brisket, scattering a 6-foot charcuterie display across the grass in seconds, cheese boards crushed beneath hooves. Guests informal were leaping over toppled chairs to avoid the stampede entirely. The wedding cake, for tiers of buttercream and fondant, lasted exactly as long as it took one panicked steer to crash through its display table, sending frosting and crystal cake stands flying across half the dance floor while photographers, stunned, kept filming purely out of instinct. Linda's scream cut through the chaos louder than anything else in the barn, a raw, undignified sound utterly unlike her usual controlled tone, as she scrambled backward away from the approaching herd. heels sinking into mud that had, moments earlier, been carefully raked decorative gravel. Madison's veil tangled around Dolly's horns almost comically, the heifer dragging several feet of white tulle across the dance floor before shaking free, leaving Madison standing in the wreckage laughing, actually laughing, a sound of pure relief escaping months of suppressed tension all at once. Tyler grabbed Madison's hand and pulled her safely behind an overturned table, both of them watching the chaos unfold with expressions far closer to amusement than fear, as though some part of them had been quietly hoping for exactly this kind of interruption all along. Gerald slipped, trying to herd a steer away from the gift table, landing flat in a puddle of spilled champagne and mud, his phone still recording from his outstretched hand, capturing footage that would later circulate online captioned simply, Briarcliff HOA President's Daughter's Wedding. Year of Our Lord 2024. Pete Salinger, drink still in hand, attempted to climb onto a folding chair to escape a curious bull calf, only for the chair to collapse beneath him, sending him sprawling directly into the path of a confused, startled cow that simply stepped neatly over him without breaking stride. The videographer's drone, originally meant to capture sweeping romantic aerial shots, instead captured a perfect overhead view of 220 guests in formal, were fleeing across a Tennessee pasture pursued by 42 head of cattle, footage that would later be viewed millions of times. Dana Brooks arrived at the property line precisely as the chaos peaked, camera already rolling, capturing Linda Whitmore screaming Claire Donovan's name. Across a wrecked reception while guests climbed over each other, escaping a stampede happening at a wedding she'd built her entire reputation around. I stood near the barn entrance, deliberately visible, watching Linda spot me through the chaos, her face shifting from panic to fury in an instant. Mud splattered across her formal dress, mascara streaking down cheeks no longer composed enough to maintain her usual practiced control. "You did this on purpose?" Linda screamed, stumbling toward me through scattered chairs and trampled flowers, and I simply replied, calmly, that gates sometimes fail on working farms, the same explanation she'd accepted without question every time her own contractors damaged my actual property. The herd, having scattered the catering tables and trampled the dance floor, began settling near the open barn doors, drawn by hay bales. Decorative staging had ironically stacked nearby, several cattle simply lying down amid the wreckage as though thoroughly satisfied with their afternoon's work. Guests slowly emerged from behind overturned tables and parked cars, some laughing nervously, others furiously checking ruined designer outfits, several already uploading shaky cell phone footage to social media under hashtags that would trend across Tennessee by dinner time that same evening. Linda, desperate to regain control of a situation rapidly spiraling beyond her, grabbed her oversized event planning tote bag, searching frantically for what she called the venue contract, to prove I'd somehow breached our agreement, except what spilled out instead was an entirely different set of papers. Loose financial documents scattered across the muddy grass, bank statements, HOA board authorization forms, vendor payment records, the exact same documents. Carol Jennings had spent weeks quietly compiling, except these were Linda's own copies, apparently carried along for reasons nobody present yet understood. Dana Brooks, camera still rolling, knelt instinctively to gather the scattered papers before wind or mud could destroy them, recognizing several document headers immediately from the files Carol had already shared, realizing in real time she was watching evidence essentially deliver itself. Carol Jennings, who'd arrived quietly as Madison's invited guest weeks before any of this chaos unfolded, pushed through the crowd toward the scattered papers, confirming aloud, clearly enough for nearby phones to capture, that these were authentic HOA reserve fund withdrawal authorizations bearing Linda's own signature. Several Briarcliff residents nearby went suspiciously quiet, exchanging glances, clearly recognizing financial document formats they'd seen before in HOA newsletters discussing routine beautification expenses, now staring at hard evidence those expenses had quietly funded their own neighbor's extravagant wedding. Linda lunged to gather the papers herself, But Dana stepped back smoothly, documents already secured, camera still recording, asking simply, professionally, whether Linda would like to comment on record about HOA reserve funds appearing in personal wedding-related financial paperwork. "This is absolutely none of your business," Linda snapped, mud streaking her face, voice rising toward hysteria, while behind her a curious steer wandered directly into the collapsed dance floor lighting rig, sending one final shower of sparks and string lights cascading dramatically across the scene. Gerald, still sprawled in mud nearby, looked up at his wife with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not embarrassment, not concern, but something closer to dawning, horrified realization, as though pieces he'd avoided examining for months had suddenly assembled themselves whether he wanted them to or not. Madison approached the scattered papers herself, picking one up with shaking hands, reading a withdrawal authorization dated 6 weeks earlier, the exact amount matching almost precisely what her mother had spent on the photographer and florist combined, and her face crumpled with a different kind of tears entirely. "Mom," Madison said quietly, voice cutting through the remaining chaos with surprising clarity. "Is this why you kept telling me not to worry about how we were paying for everything?" A question Linda had no honest answer prepared for. Not in front of 200 witnesses and a recording camera. Pete Salinger, finally upright again, mud-soaked and humiliated, attempted to slip quietly toward the parking area, only for Mark to intercept him near the gate, holding up the folder of citation paperwork we'd accumulated over 8 months, asking pointedly whether Pete cared to explain his relationship to the bride's mother. "I have no comment," Pete muttered, pushing past Mark toward his truck. But several guests had already overheard, several phones had already captured the exchange, and within hours local social media accounts had connected Pete Salinger's name to Gerald Whitmore's surname with embarrassing speed. The county sheriff's deputy, originally called for noise complaints from neighbors hearing the commotion, arrived just as Linda attempted to physically grab the financial documents back from Dana Brooks, an act several witnesses described afterward as unhinged in their own social media commentary that evening. The deputy, recognizing names already trending locally online, separated Linda from Dana calmly but firmly, suggesting everyone involved cooperate with whatever investigation inevitably followed, while cattle continued grazing peacefully amid wrecked floral arrangements just feet away from the unfolding confrontation. I finally approached Linda directly, for the first time all afternoon, holding up my own folder, the original signed contract, Patty's notarized statement about the forged addendum, photographs of every citation timed suspiciously close to every disagreement we'd ever had over the past 8 months. "Your gate failed," Linda hissed at me, grasping for any remaining authority. "And you're going to pay for every bit of damage to this wedding." I simply handed her copies of my own documentation instead, watching her face change as she realized exactly how thoroughly outmatched she'd actually been. "My gate failing," I said calmly, "doesn't forge my signature on an addendum I never agreed to. It doesn't send your husband's brother to cite my hay bales as a visual blight. And it definitely doesn't explain reserve fund withdrawals matching your florist's invoices." The crowd around us had grown noticeably quiet, phones still recording, several Briarcliff residents whispering among themselves, recalculating months of citations, and complaints they'd assumed were simply Linda enforcing reasonable community standards rather than orchestrating a personal vendetta against one stubborn farm owner. Madison stepped between her mother and me then, voice steady despite tear-streaked makeup, announcing to everyone still listening that she'd known none of this. Not the forgery, not the embezzlement, not the months of harassment her own wedding had apparently been quietly built upon. "I wanted a small wedding," Madison said, loud enough for the gathered crowd, the deputy, and Dana's still recording camera to hear clearly. "And instead I got cows crashing my reception because my mom couldn't stop trying to prove something to a country club that rejected her 2 years ago. A ripple of stunned murmurs spread through the remaining guests at that detail, several Briarcliff residents exchanging knowing glances, apparently having heard whispered versions of the Pemberton Hills rejection before but never confirmed quite so publicly, quite so devastatingly, on a day meant to showcase Linda's triumph instead. Linda opened her mouth to respond, closed it again, opened it once more, but nothing emerged except a strangled, wordless sound. The first time in 8 months I'd ever witnessed her genuinely lose the script she usually controlled so effortlessly in every single interaction. Tyler, gently pulling Madison back toward him, suggested quietly that perhaps everyone should let the deputy handle whatever needed handling, while the catering staff, remarkably composed given the circumstances, began quietly herding stray guests toward whatever undamaged food remained near the parking area. I gathered my own herd calmly with Mark's help, Dolly trotting back toward the north pasture without much protest once the excitement settled, the rest following obediently, leaving behind a wrecked dance floor, a collapsed cake table, and approximately 200 guests who would never forget this particular October Saturday. Dana Brooks secured statements from Carol Jennings, several anonymous Briarcliff residents, and even a visibly shaken Gerald, who admitted, quietly and almost relieved sounding, that he'd suspected something wasn't right with the household finances for months but had been too afraid of Linda's reaction to ask directly. The deputy collected the scattered financial documents as potential evidence, informing Linda she should expect a follow-up call from county investigators regarding HOA fund mismanagement, a sentence that seemed to finally, fully collapse whatever composure Linda had been desperately clinging to throughout the afternoon. Pete Salinger's truck peeled out of my gravel driveway minutes later, narrowly avoiding a stray catering van, while several guests filmed his departure too, adding it to a growing collection of footage that would, by Sunday morning, accumulate millions of views across every major social platform. I found Madison sitting quietly on an overturned hay bale near the wrecked dance floor, mud-streaked dress and all, looking strangely peaceful despite everything. And when I sat beside her, she simply laughed, a real laugh. Saying this had somehow turned into the most honest moment of her entire engagement. "I'm sorry about your barn," she told me, gesturing at the wreckage, and I told her honestly that the barn would clean up fine, that wood and fabric always survived worse than this, and that the only thing actually broken beyond repair today was whatever fragile fiction her mother had been maintaining for years. Tyler joined us, surveying the damage with surprising calm, admitting he'd actually wanted something exactly like this, chaotic, unplanned, memorable for reasons nobody could have predicted. Far more than the magazine perfect ceremony his mother-in-law had spent 8 months forcing into existence against everyone's actual wishes. Riley appeared from the farmhouse with bottled water for shaken guests, moving efficiently through the wreckage in a way that reminded me sharply of my grandfather Walt, the kind of quiet, practical competence that simply shows up when chaos demands it, without needing applause or recognition afterward. By 4 o'clock, most guests had departed, exchanging numbers, comparing phone footage, several already drafting social media captions that would make this wedding infinitely more famous than anything Linda's carefully curated vision board had ever originally planned for her daughter's special day. Linda remained behind long after most guests left, sitting alone near the collapsed cake table, mascara completely gone, mud staining a dress that had cost, according to Sherry, nearly $4,000. Staring blankly at scattered financial documents she no longer had any realistic chance of hiding. Gerald approached her eventually, voice low but audible to those of us still nearby, asking simply how long she'd been taking money from the reserve fund, and Linda's silence in response answered the question more completely than any words she might have offered instead. I left them to their private reckoning, walking back toward the farmhouse with Mark, both of us quiet, processing the sheer scale of what had unfolded across one single October afternoon. far beyond anything either of us had specifically planned when we'd first opened that pasture gate. "You think this actually changes anything?" Mark asked eventually, and I told him honestly that I didn't know yet, that accountability moved slowly even when caught on camera, but that for the first time in 8 months, Linda Whitmore had finally lost control of her own story completely. Dana Brooks's article went up online by 9 that evening, headlined plainly, "HOA President's Embezzlement Allegedly Funded Daughter's Wedding, Exposed by Escaped Cattle," accompanied by drone footage, Gerald's muddy phone recording, and Carol's documented financial trail, already racking up thousands of shares within the first hour alone. By midnight, the story had spread well beyond local news, picked up by regional outlets fascinated by the sheer absurdity of cattle exposing alleged embezzlement at a wedding, the kind of story too strange and too perfectly documented for anyone to resist sharing repeatedly across every platform. Madison and Tyler, meanwhile, sat together on my porch swing long after most guests had gone, watching the sun set over a wrecked but oddly peaceful pasture, agreeing quietly that whatever happened next with Linda, their actual marriage had survived its first real test better than anyone could have predicted. I sat with Mark on the farmhouse steps that night, watching headlights of departing cars trail down the gravel road, exhausted but unmistakably lighter, feeling for the first time in 8 months like my family's land finally belonged entirely, completely to us again. Sunday morning brought a knock at our door before sunrise. 2 county investigators, polite but serious, asking detailed questions about citations, inspections, and Pete Salinger's documented relationship to Gerald Whitmore, taking careful notes as Mark and I walked them through 8 months of accumulated evidence. By Monday, the Briarcliff Estates HOA board had called an emergency meeting, flooded with messages from residents demanding answers about reserve fund withdrawals. Now circulating publicly, several board members admitting they'd long suspected irregularities, but had never possessed proof solid enough to act on directly. Carol Jennings attended that emergency meeting too, finally vindicated after resigning months earlier over concerns nobody had taken seriously, presenting her documentation formally to a board now desperate to distance itself from whatever scandal had just exploded across regional news coverage overnight. Linda didn't attend the meeting herself, reportedly remaining inside her house with blinds drawn, while outside, a small but growing crowd of reporters and curious neighbors gathered near her driveway, drawn by a story that had, within 48 hours, become impossible for anyone in Briarcliff to ignore. Pete Salinger was placed on administrative leave from his county code enforcement position by Monday afternoon, pending a formal review of every citation he'd issued over the past 18 months, with particular scrutiny directed toward his documented pattern of inspections involving my specific property. A petition began circulating through Briarcliff that same Monday, signed by dozens of residents demanding Linda's immediate removal from the HOA board, citing not just the alleged embezzlement but years of accumulated grievances finally voiced openly now that speaking up no longer felt impossibly risky. I learned later that several neighbors who'd once waved cheerfully at me from their cars while driving illegally across my soybean field now approached me directly at the farmer's market, apologizing awkwardly, admitting they'd simply gone along with Linda because confronting her had never once seemed worth the trouble. Madison called me Tuesday evening, voice steadier than I'd ever heard it, explaining that her mother had finally admitted everything to a lawyer, that restitution negotiations with the HOA had already begun, and that criminal charges remained a real possibility depending on how county prosecutors ultimately viewed the evidence. "I keep thinking about all those certified letters you got," Madison told me quietly, "and how I just assumed code enforcement was being normal. I'm so sorry I didn't ask more questions sooner." I told her, honestly, that questioning a parent that thoroughly rarely comes naturally, and that her apology mattered more than she realized. Carol Jennings was formally invited back onto the HOA Finance Committee by Wednesday, this time with expanded oversight authority the board hastily approved, determined never again to let a single president control reserve fund withdrawals without independent verification from someone willing to actually ask hard questions. Gerald Whitmore moved out of the house that same week, according to neighborhood gossip that traveled faster than any official announcement, reportedly telling friends he simply couldn't stay married to someone who'd risked his reputation, his brother's career, and his daughter's wedding chasing validation from people who'd never once respected either of them. Pete Salinger's administrative leave became a formal termination by the following Friday, county officials citing clear conflict of interest violations across at least a dozen documented inspections. Every single citation he'd ever issued against my property formally reviewed for potential reversal pending county legal review. Within 2 weeks, county code enforcement officially voided every citation Pete had filed against my farm over the previous 18 months, refunding fines I'd paid for violations that, examined honestly by an impartial reviewer, had never actually existed outside Linda Whitmore's personal grievances against my family. The easement lawsuit Linda had once threatened over my grandfather's gravel road quietly disappeared entirely, her attorney withdrawing all related filings without comment, leaving the original 1962 deed standing exactly as my grandfather had intended it to stand for the family that came after him. Dana Brooks's follow-up article, published 10 days after the wedding, detailed the full scope of Linda's reserve fund withdrawals. Nearly $90,000 over 14 months, funneled through vendor invoices for community beautification that had actually paid for Madison's florist, photographer, and oversized event tent. Linda was formally removed from the HOA presidency by emergency recall vote, 83% of Briarcliff residents voting in favor, a margin so overwhelming that even longtime allies who'd once defended her controlling management style publicly acknowledged the numbers simply couldn't be ignored any longer. She issued a brief, carefully worded public apology through her attorney, expressing regret for any confusion regarding fund allocation. Language so deliberately vague that it satisfied almost nobody, least of all the neighbors who'd spent years paying mandatory dues partially diverted toward her daughter's wedding flowers. County prosecutors announced formal embezzlement charges against Linda 3 weeks after the wedding, citing clear documentary evidence of unauthorized fund transfers, while her attorney negotiated a restitution agreement requiring full repayment of misappropriated funds alongside whatever additional penalties the court eventually decided to impose. Madison, navigating her own complicated grief over her mother's unraveling, told me during one visit that part of her almost felt relieved, that growing up constantly managing Linda's need for external validation had quietly exhausted her in ways she'd never fully recognized until everything finally collapsed publicly. I used to think being good meant going along with whatever Mom wanted, Madison admitted one afternoon over coffee at my kitchen table, the same table where Linda had once signed a contract she'd later tried to forge an addendum onto. I don't think that anymore. Not after watching what happened to all of you. Tyler, meanwhile, had grown genuinely fond of the farm despite the chaos his wedding had unleashed upon it, returning several weekends afterward to help Mark repair fences, slowly becoming the kind of son-in-law neighbor my grandfather Walt would have approved of without reservation. I rebuilt the north pasture fence myself that November, stronger than before, though I privately admitted to Mark that some small, stubborn part of me almost missed having an excuse ready in case anyone ever again tried treating my family's land as theirs to claim without asking properly first. Riley returned to community college with a story nobody back on campus quite believed until she showed classmates the viral drone footage herself. Footage that had, by then, crossed 12 million views online and spawned countless memes about cattle delivering long overdue neighborhood justice. Carol Jennings eventually ran for HOA president herself the following spring, campaigning openly on financial transparency and accountability, winning easily against token opposition, finally giving Briarcliff Estates the kind of careful, honest leadership it had apparently needed for years but never quite managed to secure. Pete Salinger, unable to find comparable county employment after his termination, eventually moved out of the area entirely, his name still occasionally surfacing in local conversation whenever residents discussed exactly how thoroughly nepotism and favoritism had once infiltrated routine code enforcement decisions. Linda's criminal case moved slowly through the following months, ultimately resulting in a plea agreement requiring full restitution of the embezzled funds, several years of probation, and a permanent ban from holding any homeowners association leadership position anywhere in the state going forward. I attended the sentencing hearing mostly out of curiosity, watching Linda Whitmore, once so commanding, so utterly convinced of her own untouchable authority, stand quietly before a judge, smaller somehow, finally facing consequences that certified letters and forged signatures could no longer help her avoid. She didn't look at me during the hearing, not once, though I noticed Madison sitting several rows back, present out of obligation rather than support, her expression unreadable, carrying the particular complicated grief of loving someone whose choices had genuinely harmed people she also cared about. Afterward, in the courthouse parking lot, Madison found me briefly, thanking me again, this time without tears, simply stating plainly that whatever consequences her mother now faced, they were entirely consequences Linda had built for herself, brick by brick, certified letter by certified letter, over years of believing rules applied only to other people. I told Madison something my grandfather Walt used to say about cattle, oddly enough, that animals always eventually find whatever gate gets left open, and that the real question is never whether consequences arrive, only when and how loudly once they finally do arrive on schedule. Spring came, and with it, a quieter Briarcliff Estates. Residents who'd once feared certified letters now attending HOA meetings with genuine engagement rather than dread. Carol's transparent leadership slowly rebuilding trust that Linda's years of quiet manipulation had thoroughly eroded across the community. Madison and Tyler asked me that April whether they could hold a small, private vow renewal at the farm. Just close family, no planner, no oversized tent, no string quartet, nothing beyond what they genuinely wanted from the very beginning before Linda had ever gotten involved at all. I agreed immediately, refusing any payment this time, telling them simply that watching them get a real, honest version of their wedding day felt like the kind of restitution money could never quite capture, the kind my grandfather Walt would have appreciated far more than any rental fee. We held the small gathering in May, just 20 guests scattered across folding chairs in the same north pasture that had once hosted 42 stampeding cattle, the fence rebuilt, the grass recovering, the late spring wildflowers blooming exactly where catering tables had once stood months earlier. Madison wore a simple dress she'd chosen herself this time. No designer label. No Instagram-ready embellishments, just something she genuinely loved, and Tyler cried openly during their renewed vows in a way that felt entirely unguarded, entirely theirs, entirely free of anyone else's competing agenda. Dolly grazed peacefully nearby throughout the ceremony, occasionally glancing up with mild curiosity, utterly unaware of her newfound minor celebrity status. Among Briarcliff residents, who now occasionally drove past my fence line specifically hoping to catch a glimpse of the wedding cow, everyone still talked about. Carol attended as Madison's guest again, sitting beside Riley, the two of them laughing quietly about how thoroughly this farm had become woven into Briarcliff's collective memory, an unlikely landmark of accountability that nobody in the neighborhood would ever quite forget regardless of how many years passed. Gerald sent flowers but didn't attend, still working through his own complicated reckoning with everything his marriage had quietly enabled for years, though Madison mentioned he'd started attending therapy, slowly examining why he'd allowed Linda's behavior to go unchallenged for so painfully long. Linda, serving the early months of her probation, wasn't invited, a decision Madison made carefully and without malice, simply recognizing that her mother's presence would inevitably reshape the day around her own narrative once again. Exactly the pattern Madison had finally learned to recognize and refuse. I watched Madison and Tyler dance barefoot in the grass that evening. No professional photographer, just Riley snapping casual photos on her phone, and thought about how strange it was that the most genuine wedding moment I'd witnessed all year had emerged directly from the wreckage of the most dishonest one. Mark squeezed my hand as the sun set behind the rebuilt fence line, both of us finally feeling, 8 months after Linda's first certified letter arrived, like our family's land had survived something significant and emerged not just intact, but somehow stronger, more clearly, undeniably our own. That summer, a local agricultural magazine ran a feature on our farm, focusing mostly on Walt's original homestead history, though the reporter couldn't resist a brief mention of last year's viral wedding incident, framing it gently as proof that some land simply refuses to be claimed by anyone who hasn't earned it honestly. Briarcliff residents, under Carol's steady leadership, voted that summer to formally apologize to me as a community, a gesture I found almost unnecessary but accepted graciously anyway, recognizing it as a genuine attempt at repairing a relationship Linda had spent years deliberately poisoning. I never did plant that privacy hedge Linda had once demanded, though I did eventually plant a row of sunflowers along the shared fence line, partly out of spite, partly because sunflowers happened to be Madison's favorite, a small, deliberate choice that felt like reclaiming something Linda had once tried to dictate. Pete Salinger's replacement at County Code Enforcement, a quiet, thorough man named Daniel, visited my farm exactly once, mostly to introduce himself and confirm everything remained in good standing, an inspection that took 11 minutes and resulted, refreshingly, in absolutely nothing to fine me for. Carol's financial reforms eventually recovered most of the misappropriated reserve funds through Linda's court-ordered restitution payments, money the HOA board reinvested directly into long-delayed pool repairs and road maintenance projects that residents had been promised, then denied, for years under Linda's previous leadership. I ran into Linda exactly once more that fall, at the grocery store, both of us startled into an awkward silence near the produce section, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't an apology, just a quiet, almost defeated acknowledgement that she supposed I'd gotten exactly what I wanted out of everything. I told her honestly that I'd never wanted any of this. Not the forged signature, not the citations, not the embezzlement scandal. That I'd simply wanted to be left alone to run my family's farm without someone treating my land as a prop for her own unresolved insecurities. She didn't respond to that, just nodded slowly, picked up her groceries and walked away, and I realized, watching her go, that I felt no particular satisfaction in that small exchange, just a quiet, settled relief that this chapter of my life had finally, fully run its course. Madison and Tyler bought a small house in town that autumn, deliberately choosing a neighborhood without any homeowners association whatsoever, a decision Madison joked about openly, telling friends she'd had quite enough certified letters to last several lifetimes after everything her mother had put everyone through. Riley graduated from community college that December, planning to study agricultural business at a 4-year university the following fall, telling me proudly that watching me handle Linda's entire campaign of harassment had taught her more about quiet, persistent integrity than any classroom ever could. I kept Carol's documents, Patty's notarized statement, and my original folder of citations stored carefully in a fireproof box in the farmhouse office, not out of lingering anger, but as a reminder, the same way my grandfather Walt had once kept the original 1962 deed safe through decades of changing neighbors. Mark eventually joked that we should frame the viral drone footage screenshot and hang it in the barn, right beside Walt's old black and white photographs, a suggestion I initially dismissed as ridiculous before quietly admitting, months later, that we actually did exactly that. Visitors occasionally stopped by that following spring specifically to see the wedding pasture. A strange little tourist curiosity neither Mark nor I had ever anticipated, though we welcomed it good-naturedly, charging nothing, simply enjoying watching strangers marvel at how ordinary the rebuilt fence actually looked now. Dana Brooks's original article eventually won a regional journalism award for local reporting, and she sent me a kind note afterward, thanking me for trusting her with the story, admitting she'd never expected cattle to deliver such perfectly timed, undeniable evidence directly into her camera lens. Carol's leadership transformed Briarcliff Estates within a single year, residents reporting genuine satisfaction surveys for the first time in years, reserve funds finally transparent and properly audited, certified letters becoming rare, reasonable, and limited strictly to actual legitimate property concerns going forward. I never received a personal apology from Linda directly, not really, beyond that one quiet grocery store exchange, though I eventually decided I didn't need one, having long since stopped measuring my own peace by whether the person who'd harmed me ever properly acknowledged it. Madison sent me a handwritten letter that winter, thanking me specifically for never once treating her like an extension of her mother's failures, for letting her be exactly who she actually was throughout an entire ordeal that could have easily made her feel responsible for things entirely beyond her control. I framed that letter too, eventually hanging it quietly in the farmhouse kitchen, a small reminder that even the messiest, most chaotic conflicts sometimes produce genuine, lasting relationships among the people willing to stay honest with each other throughout the entire process. Gerald finalized his divorce from Linda that following spring, reportedly relocating to a smaller home across town, slowly rebuilding a quieter, more modest life entirely separate from the social ambitions that had once driven so many of his wife's increasingly desperate, increasingly costly decisions. Linda completed her court-ordered restitution payments 18 months after the wedding, according to public county records, though she never returned to any visible leadership role within Briarcliff Estates, eventually selling her house and moving to a different county entirely, away from neighbors who remembered everything. I heard, secondhand through Carol, that Linda had attempted joining a different homeowners association board in her new county, only to be quietly informed by that board's nominating committee that her name had already become too well documented online for anyone to seriously consider her candidacy. Some part of me, hearing that, felt something close to satisfaction after all, not cruel exactly, just the particular earned relief of watching someone who'd spent years escaping consequences finally discover that reputations, once thoroughly and publicly documented, rarely allow for quiet, convenient second chances. Mark and I marked the one-year anniversary of the wedding quietly, just the two of us, sitting on the rebuilt north pasture fence at sunset, watching Dolly graze contentedly nearby, neither of us needing to say much, both fully aware of exactly how much our family's land had endured and survived. The farm itself thrived that year, free finally of certified letters, bogus citations, and forged contracts, our cattle herd growing healthily, our crops recovering fully from every truck rut and trampled row Linda's wedding vendors had once carelessly carved across our carefully tended fields. Riley came home that summer with a boyfriend from her agricultural program, a quiet young man who admired the rebuilt fence line specifically, asking detailed questions about wire gauge and post spacing, earning Mark's immediate, enthusiastic approval in a way few of Riley's previous boyfriends ever quite managed. Madison and Tyler visited regularly throughout that year, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes to help with seasonal farm work, slowly becoming the kind of genuine family friends neither Mark nor I had ever expected to gain from what had originally felt like an unwelcome, unwanted business arrangement. I occasionally found myself explaining the entire saga to curious newcomers at the farmers market, watching their expressions shift from disbelief to delight as the story unfolded. The forged signature, the embezzlement, the cattle, each detail somehow stranger and more satisfying than the last. Carol's continued leadership eventually earned Briarcliff Estates a Regional Homeowners Association Excellence Award for financial transparency, an irony nobody in the community failed to appreciate, given how thoroughly opposite that recognition stood from everything Linda's leadership had once represented. I drove past Linda's old house occasionally, now owned by a quiet retired couple who kept a small, tasteful garden, and never once sent anyone a certified letter about anything. A peaceful, almost anticlimactic ending for a property that had once generated so much unnecessary chaos and harm. Pete Salinger's name occasionally resurfaced in local conversation whenever residents discussed county code enforcement reform, his termination becoming something of a cautionary case study for why nepotism within regulatory positions deserved far more scrutiny than it had previously received throughout the county. I testified once, briefly, before a county commission reviewing code enforcement hiring practices, sharing my own documented experience with Pete's pattern of citations, contributing in some small way to policy changes meant to prevent exactly the kind of family-connected harassment my farm had endured for months. Madison eventually returned to school herself, pursuing a degree in social work, telling me she'd developed a genuine interest in helping families navigate exactly the kind of complicated, controlling dynamics she'd spent years quietly enduring within her own household before everything finally came apart publicly. Tyler took over more responsibility at his HVAC company, eventually opening his own small business, and Mark occasionally helped him source second-hand farm equipment parts. The two men slowly developing the kind of easy, practical friendship that had nothing whatsoever to do with weddings or wealthy mothers-in-law. I thought often, throughout that entire year, about how close I'd come to simply enduring Linda's escalating demands, indefinitely swallowing each new injustice. The way I'd swallowed the very first certified letter, and how genuinely grateful I felt to Carol, Patty, Dana, and even Madison for helping me finally stop. My grandfather Walt's old toolshed, once cited as a structural hazard by Pete Salinger, still stood exactly where it always had, weathered but solid, and I made a point of photographing it every single season afterward, a small private ritual celebrating how thoroughly that particular accusation had been formally voided. Briarcliff Estates eventually installed a small community garden near the clubhouse, funded partially through Linda's restitution payments, a modest, practical project Carol's board approved specifically because actual residents had requested it, rather than because any single leader wanted something flashy enough to photograph impressively. I attended one community garden dedication ceremony that following spring, invited as a token of goodwill by Carol's board, standing somewhat awkwardly among neighbors, who'd once treated my farm as either a nuisance or a convenient backdrop, now treating me instead as simply another respected member of the broader community. Madison gave a short, unscripted speech at that same dedication, mentioning briefly, without bitterness, how her own wedding had inadvertently helped expose problems within the neighborhood that badly needed addressing, framing the entire chaotic saga as something the community had ultimately grown stronger from confronting honestly. I caught Carol's eye during that speech, both of us exchanging a small, knowing smile, fully aware of exactly how much quiet, careful work, documents, testimony, patient persistence, had gone into transforming one disastrous wedding into genuine, lasting institutional change within Briarcliff Estates. Mark and I hosted a small farm-to-table dinner that autumn for Carol, Madison, Tyler, Patty, and Dana, an informal gathering thanking everyone who'd helped uncover the truth, served at the very same long table where Linda had once signed, then attempted to secretly alter our original simple contract. Dana joked over dinner that this entire saga had practically written itself for her, joking that she owed her regional journalism award almost entirely to 42 perfectly timed, thoroughly uncooperative cattle, a comment that had the whole table laughing harder than anything else said all evening. Patty mentioned, quietly, how satisfying it had felt confirming that forged signature months earlier, admitting she'd worried briefly about overstepping, before deciding that protecting an honest neighbor from clear, deliberate fraud fell well within any reasonable definition of simply doing her job properly and thoroughly. Carol reflected more seriously on how close Briarcliff Estates had come to permanent, unchecked financial corruption, admitting she still sometimes wondered how many Other communities operated under similarly unquestioned leadership, never lucky enough to have cattle, a sharp notary, and a determined reporter align so perfectly. I raised a quiet toast that evening, not to revenge, which had never really been my actual goal, but to the slow, patient accumulation of evidence and honest allies that eventually makes accountability possible, even against people who seem, for far too long, completely untouchable. Madison toasted next, simply thanking everyone for treating her like a person worth protecting rather than simply her mother's daughter. A distinction she said had taken her entire adult life to learn how to recognize, let alone insist upon for herself going forward. Winter arrived again, marking 18 months since that chaotic October wedding. The farm settled now into its familiar rhythms, cattle grazing peacefully across pastures that had fully recovered from every trampled flower arrangement and collapsed dance floor of that singular, unforgettable afternoon. I occasionally received messages from strangers who'd watched the viral drone footage online, asking whether everything had genuinely turned out as well as local news coverage suggested, and I always answered honestly, better, actually, in ways I never could have predicted back when I first opened that gate. Riley, home for winter break, helped me reorganize the fireproof document box that had once held our entire case against Linda, suggesting we finally donate the original folder of voided citations to the County Historical Society, as an odd but fitting record of how thoroughly justice had eventually, properly arrived. Mark laughed at that suggestion, then admitted it actually made sense, calling it the most boring exhibit the Historical Society will ever display. Though he agreed readily, recognizing the documents represented something genuinely meaningful about persistence, evidence, and patience finally paying off. Madison and Tyler announced that winter they were expecting their first child, sharing the news with us personally before most of their own extended family. A gesture that moved me more than I expected, recognizing how thoroughly our families had become entwined since that disastrous original wedding day. I told Madison, only half joking, that her child would someday inherit quite a story about cattle, embezzlement, and a viral wedding video, and Madison laughed, agreeing readily, already planning to tell the story herself someday as proof that even the worst days sometimes lead somewhere genuinely good. Carol's continued leadership eventually inspired several neighboring HOA communities to adopt similar financial transparency reforms, her examples circulating quietly through regional homeowners association networks as a practical model for preventing exactly the kind of unchecked authority Linda had once wielded so carelessly. I never did collect any insurance claim for the wrecked dance floor, the collapsed cake table, or the trampled decorative fencing, deciding instead that watching Linda's entire carefully constructed reputation collapse alongside it had been, frankly, more valuable compensation than any check could have provided. Mark eventually replaced the original north pasture gate latch with a heavier, more deliberate mechanism, only half joking that he wanted to make absolutely certain no future accidental opening could ever again be blamed entirely on simple farm equipment failure, should anyone else ever try testing our patience again. I stood at that very gate one final evening that winter, watching the sun set over land my grandfather Walt had worked honestly for 60 years, land that had briefly become a battleground, then a stage for chaos, then finally, fully, undeniably, simply our own family's farm once more. Whatever Linda Whitmore had once hoped to prove to Pemberton Hills Country Club, to her neighbors, to herself, she'd instead proven something else entirely. That authority built on forgery, theft, and quiet cruelty eventually collapses, usually at the worst possible moment, often delivered by something as simple and honest as 42 hungry cattle. 6 weeks after sentencing, the county finalized Linda's restitution payments, and Briarcliff Estates posted its first fully transparent annual financial report in years. Every dollar accounted for, every vendor invoice matched honestly against actual community projects rather than personal vendettas disguised as beautification spending. The HOA board, under Carol's leadership, formally adopted new bylaws requiring independent audits, multiple signatures on large withdrawals, and term limits for board presidents. Structural changes specifically designed to ensure no single resident could ever again quietly accumulate the kind of unchecked authority Linda had once enjoyed. Pete Salinger's wrongful termination appeal was formally denied by the County Review Board that spring, the panel citing clear, well-documented evidence of conflict of interest and abuse of inspection authority, closing that particular chapter with the same quiet, thorough finality everything else had eventually received. My farm's commercial license, once threatened repeatedly by bogus citations, was renewed that same spring without complication, the county inspector noting cheerfully that everything appeared in excellent standing. A phrase I read 3 times simply to enjoy how ordinary, how unremarkable, my own property finally felt to describe. Madison and Tyler welcomed their daughter the following autumn, naming her Dolly's middle name affectionately as a private family joke nobody outside our small circle ever fully understood. A small, warm tribute to the stubborn old heifer who'd accidentally started an entire reckoning 18 months earlier. Linda relocated permanently out of state by the following year, her name still occasionally surfacing in regional news retrospectives about homeowners association corruption, remembered now less as a powerful community leader and more as a cautionary example of exactly what happens when unchecked authority finally meets honest accountability. I still walk that north pasture most evenings, past the rebuilt fence, past the sunflowers blooming along the shared property line, past the very gate latch, where one quiet decision changed everything, feeling nothing but settled, earned peace where 8 months of stress and certified letters once lived instead. My family's farm survived droughts, tornadoes, certified letters, forged signatures, and one unforgettable stampede through $1 million wedding, and in the end, it wasn't lawyers or lawsuits that finally brought Linda Whitmore down. It was 42 cattle, an open gate, and the simple, patient truth she could never quite outrun. The END.